Sorry. Hello, my name is Nancy Cheshire, and I am a member of COPE Council and the trustee board. I'm vice chair of COPE, and I'm going to be the moderator for today's webinar. We're very happy to have you here, and I think this is going to be a really fascinating discussion. The name of the webinar is Enhancing Partnerships of Institutions and Journals. These are the speakers today. I'm going to go through a more thorough introduction of them in just one moment. This is going to be the format of today's talk or today's webinar. I'm going to do a brief introduction and then the presentations and then the questions and answers. For some years, COPE has been discussing the fundamental relationships between publication ethics and research ethics. Publication ethics being part of research and research publishing. COPE has very recently launched a membership for selected invited universities and institutions, and will open up this category of membership more generally later this year. By opening its membership in this way, COPE hopes to bring more people together to help educate and promote an understanding of the principles of publication ethics from the ground up. These collaborations will help us solve the publication ethics problems we share and promote integrity in research publishing better, fostering a culture of responsibility for the integrity of the literature. This webinar will look at the issues around the relationships between editors, publishers, and institutions. Sabine Kleinert will be our first speaker. She is the deputy editor at The Lancet, and will be describing for us today the results of the CLUE workshop around the topic of today. So Sabine, please go ahead.
Thanks very much, Nancy. So I'm delighted to kick off this webinar today and talk about an effort that I've done some years ago now with Liz Wagers and others, and that is guidelines on how universities and editors can best cooperate. And these are called CLUE guidelines, which stands for Cooperation and Liaison between Universities and Editors. So when we talk about cooperation in these misconduct cases, and I'm now just talking about an editor's perspective. So what are the problems in these kind of interactions? So it's often really difficult for editors to identify whom to contact at an institution. It's not often clearly delineated who would be the first best person, who is the research integrity officer, who is responsible, maybe the vice dean for research, and it varies from university to university and from country to country. And then when an institutional investigation has been agreed, they're often slow, they're not always thorough, sometimes they're not independent, and definitely not very transparent in many cases. What to do when there are no institutions or when several institutions are involved? And often when institutions do conduct investigations, and it hasn't been initiated by journals or editors, journals and editors are not informed or informed at a very late stage. And the report of the institutional investigation is very rarely published or sometimes not even shared with the journal. And then institutions are really more concerned about employment laws, sanctions, culpability, rather than the scientific record. So basically, journals and institutions have very different perspectives here. Journals are mostly, interested in the research validity and the accuracy of the scientific record, whereas universities think about their reputation, about the culpability of those involved, about employment laws, about legal repercussions. And this is where we need to bridge the gap. This is just an example that we got at the Lancet a few years back, when a hospital, and that was based in the US actually, were reviewing, and they're writing to us saying, we are reviewing concerns about the integrity of certain data. included in the following published paper. While the institutional review of the veracity of the data in this paper is ongoing, we have determined that a retraction is warranted. But because of the review this paper is ongoing, we cannot provide any additional details at this time. And this is obviously a difficult situation, and we as editors would then not retract on such a basis when we haven't got any further information what this is based upon. In this particular case, we issued an expression of concern and then awaited the outcome of the institutional investigation. So the Clue workshop, and this is the picture of our first get together. This was under the auspices of both EMBO and COPE, and we held a workshop in Heidelberg back in 2016. And people involved came from different countries, from the UK, US, South Africa, Germany, Croatia, Australia, and the Netherlands, and also very different backgrounds: a dean, a vice chancellor, research integrity officers, editors, publishers, funder, a lawyer, a director at ORI, Office of Research Integrity in the US, and a director of research integrity. So it was a very varied, smallish group, and we brainstormed about these guidelines between journals and institutions. Many research integrity cases really involve work that is submitted or published in an academic journal, and the full investigation, as I've said before, and resolution of such cases does require the liaison between universities and journals. And COPE did publish early guidelines on this in 2012, and Clue then evolved from the discussions at the World Conferences on Research Integrity on the outstanding issues of these guidelines and the implementation. The actual document was published in 2021 in the Research Integrity and Peer Review Journal, and you can go and look there at more detailed background, but I have taken out the actual recommendations for research institutions. And these are the four here. The research institutions should develop mechanisms for assessing the integrity of reported research that are distinct from processes to determine whether individual research have committed misconduct. That's very different to what's happening right now. And they should release relevant sections of the reports of research integrity or misconduct investigations to the journals that have published the research that was investigated. They should take responsibility for research performed under their auspices, regardless of whether the researcher still works at that institution or how long ago the work was done. And then the work with funders to ensure essential research data is retained for at least 10 years. Those were the four recommendations from Clue aimed at institutions. And a little later on, I will show you some data with the difficulties of some of this. In Clue, the recommendations for journals was that journals or editors should respond to institutions about research integrity cases in a timely manner, because there's a two-way street, of course, and journals are not always doing the right thing either. So journals should also have criteria for determining whether and what type of information and evidence relating to the integrity of research reports should be passed on to the institution. They should pass on research integrity concerns to institutions, regardless of whether they intend to accept the work for publication. So not just reject the paper and wash the hands. They should retain peer review records for at least 10 years to enable investigations of manipulation or other inappropriate behavior by authors or reviewers. So what we did also, and that was done 2022 last year and led by Liz Wager, who's also provided me with these slides, so thanks to her, we did a survey of UK universities about these guidelines. And it was an electronic survey done in conjunction with UK Research Integrity Office. And we sent this survey to 110 of their subscriber institutions, which are mainly UK universities, out of 140 universities in University UK that are listed. And these data were presented last year at the 7th World Conference in Research Integrity in Cape Town. Out of the 110 contacted, we got 39 responses, and there are some of the data here. So one of the questions was, does your institution release relevant parts of investigation reports to affected journals? And it's good to see that a majority does, but there's quite a high number also. 6 of the 39 institutions say they will not and are unlikely to do in the near future because they're worried about substantial HR and GDPR implications. The other question, does your institution allow journals to quote from the investigation reports or cite them in the retraction? And there, a very high proportion, sort of 9, said that they have no plans and unlikely to do that. So you see there are issues here. So there's also problems when universities are trying to contact journals. So not all journals or editors are responsive. So there were only 2 respondents who said that this was not a problem at all. And some people didn't know. It was highly variable between journals in some of the responses. And quite a number said it was a moderate problem or a serious problem. So journals need to do better too. About historical cases, so does your institution respond to concerns by people who no longer work there or for work done a long time ago? And it's good to see that the majority are doing that, but again, 6 say they're unlikely to do that. And the comments were, it's very difficult to justify resources to put into historical investigations. Does your institution ensure that research data are retained for at least 10 years? That's the majority doing, that's great to see. But there are still 3 saying they're unlikely to do this. So the biggest difference, I think, in CLUE to what is currently happening is that CLUE proposes that institutions have mechanism to assess the validity of publications, that it is completely distinct from processes for assessing individuals' misconduct. And 40% said that they were unlikely to do this in the near future. This is the area, I think, where we have to most work on and push more. The comments were that it was difficult to distinguish misconduct in publication practice from overall employee misconduct. Well, I don't think I would quite agree with that, but it's obviously not something that people have thought about very thoroughly as yet. And people said it's not feasible on a large scale at all. And small institutions find it difficult to do and simply do not have resources to guarantee doing this routinely. So I think, this is the area where it would be most helpful if this could be implemented, but there are big barriers. So I will close now and hope to see you all in Athens in 2024 for the 8th World Conference on Research Integrity, where some of these issues will be discussed further. But I'm really pleased to say that Susan Garfinkel, who I'm now going to hand over to, has actually taken CLUE another step forward to the next level, and she will tell us all about that. Thank you.
Hi, before Susan starts, I want to do a adequate introduction of her, which I failed to do for Dr. Kleinhardt. Susan Garfinkel is the Associate Vice President for Research Compliance at The Ohio State University. She is responsible for developing, implementing, and leading programs and policies to ensure university compliance with federal, state, and private sponsors' requirements. She assists the university employees in following university policies to support and promote ethical research practices. Previously, Susan served as the Director for the Division of Investigative Oversight, the DIO, in the U.S. Office of Research Integrity, known as the ORI. She has participated as faculty for conferences to train state and federal court judges on various scientific and technological issues related to genetics and molecular biology, and is a founding member of the Asian Pacific Rim Research Integrity Network. So now I pass this on to Dr. Garfinkel.
So thank you very much. So I work at The Ohio State University, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the things that happen on the university side and how we try to expand on the CLUE guidelines that Sabina talked about. So the first thing I want to go into is what is the institution's process? Because I think that this is kind of a black box for a lot of people who are outside of this process. So the institution, when it receives an allegation of potential research misconduct, there's a 3-phase process that goes on. The first is an assessment of the allegation. And the assessment is basically to determine whether the allegation fits the definition of research misconduct and is specific and credible so that you could move forward with the allegation. So it's a pretty low bar when you receive an allegation to say, okay, we're going to initiate a formal process with an inquiry. So the next step in the process is an inquiry. The inquiry is conducted either by a panel of faculty, or in some cases, it's handled by the research integrity officers, the RIO's office, which is usually in the Office of Research Compliance or Research Integrity, and usually sits within the Office of Research at the university. The inquiry is the first step in the process that's really a preliminary fact finding so that you can gather information to determine whether the allegations has substance. This means if it has substance, it moves on to an investigation. If you find that it doesn't have substance, then you can stop the inquiry and close the case. If it moves on to an investigation, you again impanel a group of faculty with the proper subject matter expertise to look at the allegation, determine whether there's falsification, fabrication, or plagiarism, determine who was responsible, and determine if it's a significant departure from accepted practices, which are the 3 criteria for making a finding of research misconduct. So that committee makes a finding of research misconduct and then recommends sanctions for the university. While the institution is going through its process, there's oversight by various federal agencies. So the largest funding source in the United States is the National Institutes of Health, and the agency that oversees that funding is the Office of Research Integrity, where I worked for several years. So I'm going to use ORI, the Office of Research Integrity, as an example of how the institution and federal agencies interact. So the top is just the institutional process. So how does the federal government get involved? Well, sometimes allegations are made right to the Office of Research Integrity, right to ORI. If that's the case, then ORI will do the assessment and then refer it to the institution for either an assessment or an inquiry. When ORI reviews it at the assessment, they could find that there's nothing to it and they could close it. It's called an administrative closure. They also can go on to inquiry, where the institution does the inquiry and then reports back to ORI, and the case can be closed at that point as well. Or it goes on to a full investigation, and if there are no findings, then the case is closed. The investigation is conducted at the institution, not at ORI. So when the institution finishes its process, it sends all the information, all the documents, everything to the ORI, and ORI will then look at all of the data to determine whether they can make findings for the federal government. So findings, if they determine that they want to make findings for the federal government, there are several different agencies that each have their own policies. There's the Office of Research Integrity, there's the National Science Foundations, there's a Veterans Administration, there's the US Department of Agriculture, and a few others, but these are the primary ones that fund the research that is done in many universities. ORI, the agencies go through their process, they go through the oversight, and there's lots of interactions between the institution and the federal agencies when this is ongoing, because the federal agency is relying on the institutional findings in order to make federal findings. And at the end of the process, there's an appeal that happens where the respondent can actually appeal the findings of the federal government. I should say that throughout the whole institutional process, there's several steps where appeals can happen, where respondents challenge what the committees are doing. So as you can see, this is a complicated process, and I hope that this explains a little bit about why an institutional inquiry is not a simple matter that can just be handled at the institution and then you're done. So what happens then when the institution finishes its processes and determines that there are some papers that need to be corrected or retracted, or somebody submitted a paper that needs to be withdrawn? Well, Sabina gave you a really good explanation of some of the challenges, and the clue guidelines were developed several years ago. I remember when Liz Wagers, I think, presented it the first time at a world conference, and I was surprised because it had some recommendations that would be difficult for universities to manage. As Sabine said, institution says they're not going to do this. So obviously the problems that existed several years ago still exist. And the communications can be very challenging with corrections and retractions. As a Rio, I see that, and I've been contacted by many journal editors who see the same kinds of problems. A lot of this stems from confidentiality requirements. So the questions about what information should be shared. A lot of it comes from the fact that these groups work on different timelines, because institutional processes take a really long time. It's a very burdensome process. And journal processes can move a lot quicker. One of the big questions that affect the institutional process is who journals should contact. Should they contact the institution or should they contact the author? So these are questions that Rios in the United States have been dealing with, and we have meetings and we talk about it, and it's very difficult to come up with some kinds of best practices. So that's what we tried to do. There were 3 Rios in the United States that put together a working group. We were supposed to meet in person in 2020, and we all know what happened in 2020. COVID hit us. And a meeting that we had planned with COPE, with the interaction of COPE, was canceled. But we waited and we waited. And finally, we decided, okay, we're just going to try to hold these meetings virtually. So we held about 12 different virtual meetings between June and March. June 21 and March 22. And we discussed 6 different topics: handling allegations, proper context, appropriate context, and when concerns arise, what information should be shared, and how journals handle expression of concerns, retractions, and corrections. We got a group of Rios. It was all the United States. This was very US focused because we wanted to develop practices that we all understood very clearly, and hope that the best practices that we developed could be expanded on an international level by tailoring the recommendations that we came up with to the culture and standards of whatever country the people were from. So each session started with a brief introduction by a presentation on the topic by the Rio, and then one by the editor. And then we had an open forum and discussion on best practices. So this was a really interesting challenge for me, because this was a group of about 25 or 30 people who did not all know each other, who had many challenges in dealing with each other. And we wanted to kind of be flexible in our thinking and come up with ways that we could develop some best practices. And these best practices are going to be difficult because it's getting out of your comfort zone and trying to do things that force the edge of where you're comfortable. And it's difficult, including me. I find it difficult, but we came up with some practices anyway. So the first thing we learned is that both groups have different objectives, interests, and focus. I think Sabina talked about this clearly. What we came up with, though, is something to really consider, that editors and Rios can engage in hypothetical discussions. And some of the concerns that institutions have about an author's reputation being harmed when they notify an institution can be alleviated if they contact a Rio with a hypothetical discussion. And you could talk about this where the Rio is not going to initiate a process because it's only providing guidance in what's the best way to handle this particular situation. I also found that everybody was really very positive about finding a way to manage this. And finding a way to manage this allows you to talk and builds trust with each other just by knowing each other and talking about the problems, which is going to lead to better transparency in trying to deal with these processes. There were many similarities between the RIOs and between the editors. Both care about protecting the scientific record. Both are bound by strict confidentiality requirements, which actually does get in our way sometimes. Both experience problems with the current interactions. The status quo is not working for us. Both have difficulties finding the right person on the other side. And as Sabina said, by prominently posting information, both the editors and institutions have a responsibility to do that. So it's easy to find the person that you can contact. And both have trouble with timely responses. I have contacted journal editors and months go by, I don't hear anything. And journal editors have told me that they face the same problem. So in August of 22, we developed a best practices document that's very detailed and very long, and we posted it online with a description of all of our discussions and what we came up with and what our recommendations are, hoping that we were going to get a lot of comments, which we did not, unfortunately. But in June this year, we published a shorter version with the recommendations in JAMA Network Open. So hopefully you can all read it and see what you think. From the RIO perspective, we learned that editors handle publication issues outside of research misconduct, many issues, and the RIOs do not want to hear about them. I'm sure editors don't want to hear about a lot of things that RIOs deal with. Same is true for RIOs. We learned that editors feel very constrained by what they view as a contract with the authors and the potential to damage their reputation. The timelines are different. And this really comes from the complexity of the institutional process, but primarily because institutions have to figure out not only is the data flawed, the data or text falsified, fabricated, or plagiarized, but they also have to determine who was responsible. So the responsibility and assigning responsibility to somebody is very difficult, and it depends on finding the right evidence to show that this person was responsible. And that's what takes so long in these processes. The current forensic tools that we have, we could do image analysis that makes it pretty easy. I won't say easy, but it makes it much faster to determine whether something is false, fabricated, or plagiarized. But finding out who is responsible is where it becomes very difficult. The RIOs also struggle with who to contact at the journals and what information to share. From the journal perspective, it's a lot of the same issues. Editors learn that the RIO's job is complex, and we handle lots of different things that are dictated by federal laws and federal oversight. Editors learn that allegations that aren't FFP, falsification, fabrication, and plagiarism, are directed to the academic unit in the school, and authorship disputes are usually handled by those academic authors, academic offices, not by the RIO's office. Obviously, the journal's focus is the accuracy of the data, and they're not concerned with who actually committed the research misconduct. And they struggle in determining whether it's appropriate to contact the author or the RIO, and when is the best time to make this contact. Also, the editors learn that when authors become aware of the allegations, this is very difficult for RIOs, because the first step in a process is sequestration of data. You have to gather the data so that you have the evidence to make a finding of research misconduct. And believe it or not, I'm sure you probably believe it, destruction or tampering with data occurs often, I wouldn't say very often, but sometimes, and impairs how you can conduct the investigation. So this is a very big problem for RIOs and the research misconduct process. So overall, the working group came to some key recommendations through all the discussions. And we frame this as a call for actions for institutions and journals, because these are difficult recommendations to implement. it's easy to make a recommendation, but it's much more difficult to implement them. And we want the community to understand what the concerns are and why these recommendations were made. So the first recommendation is to expand the need to know criteria. In the federal regulations and most institutional policies, they state that disclosures are prohibited unless there's a need to know, but nobody defines what the need to know criteria is. So journals have, institutions have generally taken a very narrow position on who has a need to know. And it's only those people involved in the process. And the reasons why they don't share information is because they're worried about breaching confidentiality and having respondents sue them because the process was not handled correctly. So we recommend that journals should be one of the entities that have the need to know. It would allow RIOs and journals to engage at an earlier time, because it would allow you to engage with each other because you're saying that, okay, the journal has a need to know. And the problem here is that this is a significant change in how institutions interpret confidentiality provisions. And we have to figure out the next steps. So from this working group, the next step is going to be trying to find ways for RIOs to implement this change. How would you do it? What would it look like? And I am actually putting out a call to the RIOs and editors on this call. If you're interested in joining in that process to try to develop some kind of way to do this, please contact me and let me know. The second recommendation was regarding the accuracy and validity of the data and the individual's culpability. As I said, these are two issues that you deal with in trying to make a finding of research misconduct. But can we separate them? Can we separate when we determine that the data is not accurate and invalid? Can we contact a journal and not release anything about the individual's culpability and intent, or that there's a research misconduct proceeding, or that who the parties are that are involved in it? And by doing that, still maintain confidentiality and not breach confidentiality. What this enables is institutions and journals to communicate at an earlier time in a research misconduct proceeding. So as soon as an institution finds out that the data is invalid, they should be able to call a journal and say, we found that this is invalid. This is why we found it was invalid, and provide enough data about enough information about the data itself and not about who was involved, who was responsible, or whether there's a research misconduct process going on. What this requires is that both sides respect confidentiality as much as possible and limit sharing of information to any other external parties. Which is critical, because if you develop a relationship with the journals, a RIO and a journal, an editor, you should be able to trust each other to know that this is something that can work. So that was the second recommendation. The third is to have journals change their policies a little to raise author awareness of changes, saying that a journal will contact an institution regarding FFP concerns. So this is where it becomes hard for journals. The other two recommendations are difficult for institutions. This one is hard for journals. We want journals to, of course, take allegations seriously, including anonymous allegations. We want journals to be able to collaborate with other journal editors, because many cases involve multiple papers and multiple journals are involved. We also want journals to recognize that when you contact an author who does have something to hide, they may provide very misleading information and not provide the full story. They may not be lying, but by omission of facts, they're giving you a very inappropriate story of what's going on. And this has happened to me several times. In order to raise awareness, we recommended that the information for authors clearly state the ethical policies that the journal has, that the authorship criteria includes responsibility for the accuracy and integrity of the work, that should be stated, that the notice to the authors should include the journal's intent to contact an author's institution when an author's response to a concern about it, when the author's response about the accuracy of the data is unsatisfactory. We recommend that the information for authors also include that editors may contact the institutions for assistance with publishing, and that under certain circumstances, the institution will be contacted without the author's knowledge, so that the institution can appropriately handle its process. So those are our key recommendations. We're hoping to have some follow-up meetings that occur as in the near future, as soon as we can get it together. And if anybody is interested in working with us on that, please contact me and let me know. So thank you very much.
Yeah, so Marie, thank you very much for being our next speaker. And Susan, thank you for that very informative conversation. I want to introduce Marie Solier, who leads strategic publishing projects in open access publishing with a specific focus on research integrity and quality peer review, balanced with operational efficiency and automation. She was closely involved in developing Frontiers Artificial Intelligence Review Assistance, known as AIRA, and she was elected to the COPE Council in 2020. So Marie, with that, take it away.
Thank you, Nancy. And thank you to Sabine and Susan for their nice presentations just before. It follows really well on what I'm about to describe, which is about the COPE Council recommendations and the guidelines that we have published before. So to Nancy's introduction, I'm just going to ask that I did research at universities in biochemistry and bioinformatics for 8 years before bridging into publishing. So I did experience some of the dynamics involved in interactions between institutions and publishers from both sides. I also participated in the European SOPs for RI project to help design standard operating procedures and guidelines that research performing organizations can draw on for developing their research integrity offices. So COPE has had, as Susan mentioned, for some time, guidelines on the cooperation between research institutions and journals on research integrity cases. There was a first version in 2012 that was revised in 2018. And as we initiated the new membership with institutions this year, we felt it was a good time to revise this to make it more actual and integrate further feedback from our new institutional members, as well as obviously what Sabine presented about CLUE guidelines and the working group that Susan just presented. So I've integrated all the notes from this consultation and the feedback from these two groups, and I'll give you a summary of the guidelines as they are and highlight some of the changes that we've implemented that will link really nicely to what you've just seen from the two other presenters. And at the end, I'll present the 4 major pending points that we have right now that would be up for discussion that we'd like to hear your thoughts on today as well, where you can post your comments in the Q&A and we'll take those into consideration when we finalize the guidelines. So first, a summary of what we recommended in the guidelines. I'll start with institutions and then go to publishers. So a main point is, as was highlighted before as well, institutions need really to have a point of contact for investigations. This was slightly changed from the previous point where we really wanted a point of contact that was a research integrity officer, but we know that this can vary depending on institutions. Also, if they are smaller institutions, there can be somebody doing investigations, even if they're not officially an officer. And any contact details really need to be prominently available on public websites. We would like institutions to inform journals about cases that have research integrity issues or misconduct that affect the reliability or attribution of the work. As was mentioned, even if there is no clear misconduct, there can be other things that affect the reliability of the work, and that would warrant journals knowing and publishers so they can make changes to the published record. Institutions respond to journals if they request information about any kind of issues related to authorship, misleading reporting, competing interests, and other factors. It could be including investigations for honest error if authors request retractions because they cannot repeat their findings. And institutions should initiate inquiries into unacceptable publication practices or allegations of research misconduct if the potential violation occurred when the researcher worked at the institution. This was also mentioned previously. This is important that even if a researcher no longer works at the institution, if the work was performed when they were, this should still fall under the institution's remit, because they are the ones who have the data in principle and have the information on what happened at the university or the institution at that time. And institutions should have policies supporting responsible research in general and policies and procedures for investigations in general. Moving on to journals and publishers, they should have a process for raising queries, the same as we just mentioned for institutions, a clear process published on their webpage with contact details for the point of contact. One change that we did was that we acknowledge that right now, with the way that publishing is set up, the different publishing models, a lot of time is going to be the publisher more than the journal who will be handling research integrity cases. So as long as either of their contacts are available on each journal's webpage, this is good. It's a point of contact for any queries, anonymous or not, from people who want to raise them. Journals and publishers should inform institutions if they suspect misconduct. That was mentioned previously as well. Journals need to be in touch, even if it's about a misconduct on a paper that they are rejecting and not publishing. There are cases that need to be raised with institutions. We have a lot of guidelines on COPE that mention the point where we recommend contacting institutions. Usually there's a first contact with authors before, and then contacting institutions if the authors provide an explanation that is unsatisfactory or if they do not reply. Journals should be ready to cooperate with investigations and respond promptly to institutions. This was mentioned. Obviously, journals that do not reply, this is not an okay practice, and they should make sure to reply to institutions about any questions related to investigations. And journals and publishers should really be prepared to issue any amendments to published articles. So this can be expressions of concerns, corrections, addenda, retractions, anything that needs to be done according to COPE guidelines. And it can be following findings from institutional investigations or their own investigations, but this needs to happen to ensure the published record is kept correct. Journals should have policies and procedures to respond to institutions so that they know what to do in these kinds of cases, and should promote good publishing practices and have processes to identify issues. Obviously, ideally, publishers should try to identify misconduct early in the publication process so cases are discovered before publication. And as mentioned earlier, they can then inform institution, and some investigations can happen directly without further papers being published with additional misconducts. So 4 highlights of changes that we did. Previous guidelines mostly mentioned, as I said, journals, who obviously are publishing the research and interacting with the authors mainly, but in current publishing models, a lot of research integrity investigations are done at the publisher level. And this is made clearer now across the guidelines. We see this also a lot with COPE cases where we contact journals for escalated cases, and then they actually refer us to integrity managers at the publisher who host journals. So it's good to mention publishers throughout these. In the changes, we're highlighting reinforcing the need for collaboration from institutions and allegations of misconduct, as well as cases of reliability and validity issues. That was highlighted as well by Susan. This is something that should probably be separated at institutions, that misconducts are one thing and reliability issues are somewhat separate sometimes, but of course, both need to be investigated and the findings need to be shared with journals if the record needs to be modified, the publishing record. We are removing from the guidelines asking authors directly for institutional contact. When there are allegations of misconduct, rather we're suggesting that the journal and publisher should be able to find on the institutional website the points of contact for these situations. If they should reach out to, if they can't find it, they should reach out to the vice president, provost for research, or the most senior person that they can find at the institution to request a name, email, or phone number of the correct institutional contact for these different kinds of allegation. This is obviously in line with the first point of the guidelines for institutions to ensure they have a process in place to handle cases and the name of a contact person for handling cases. And the fourth major change so far is about narrowing down the previous guidelines on sharing information from institutions to journals regarding ongoing investigations. This was highlighted by both the previous speakers as well. There are confidentiality issues and many institutions are unlikely to disclose information about ongoing investigations. Depending on countries, the regulations are different. But as Susan mentioned, one of the working group's recommendation was to focus on disclosures regarding data and text, but nothing about ongoing procedures and the parties involved. And we think this will enable a better cooperation between journals without delaying some of the actions that might be needed to safeguard the scientific record. And journals should be able to use that information for notices, for expressions of concerns, retractions, corrections. So we think this is a better commitment in guidelines to ask this sharing of text and data and not ask for a total share, which was what was in the previous guidelines. So this is a more reasonable approach and something that is more likely to be able to be done by institutions with the guidelines that Susan and her group are going to be working on. So I wanted to highlight then 4 particular points where we find ourselves with these outstanding queries and debates internally, even before we've finalized the revisions on these recommendations. And we'd really like to hear your thoughts on these. You can pop comments in the Q&A, as I mentioned, or you can write us an email, or in a couple of weeks when this discussion is going to be posted on the website, there's also going to be a comments section. So that's also a place where you can share, but feel free to contact us directly if you want to share your notes on this as well. So from the feedback we've received, one of the points of contention is really the authorship disputes, where journals can do very little and often refer authors to institutions, and most institutions will not include these disputes in research misconduct and won't have the investigations in their research offices. They might refer it to other parts of the institutions, some will not. And so we find ourselves in a situation where no one can really handle these cases except the authors themselves. Obviously, when they raise it with us, it's because they were unable to do that. So somebody somewhere needs to be mediating. And so we wanted to hear from you whether you've experienced a successful process with this at your institution or your journal, and what you think would be the best way to handle these 2 frequent issues. I think it's something that all journals see very frequently, unfortunately, and we want to make the best recommendation for institutions and journals on this. The second point is the usage of the different words, the reliability, validity, integrity, and misconduct. So we feel like there should be, in a way, 2 buckets of issues that should be investigated by institutions and referred to by journals. So first would be the research integrity and misconduct that would be kind of together for situations related to fraudulent behaviors, falsification, manipulation, plagiarism. And the second bucket would be about the reliability and validity of research for cases where there are concerns that don't allow validation of conclusions, data, or that might warrant corrections, retractions, even if an actual misconduct or who has the fault or the responsibility doesn't matter, or there's no fault actually. So this would be typically for cases of honest errors, issues with replication, or sometimes misleading text that need to be edited. So we know there is no definition of misconduct that is accepted by everyone, and we don't want to restrict those guidelines to interactions for misconduct, because we know there are so many cases, as was mentioned as well before, that are investigated by editors and journals that go beyond just the misconduct because they relate to the published record as a whole. So if some of you would like to share your thoughts and weigh in on this, it would be very useful as we continue our internal exchange on the topic. And the third main point to finalize is regarding the sharing of information from investigation. We've touched on it quite a bit, but I leave it there. That obviously, due to confidentiality concerns at institutions that are unlikely to disclose some of the information, what is reasonable to share. There's a recommendation from the working group where data and text can be done without the involved parties naming and things like that to keep the confidentiality, but allow moving forward with investigations from the journal side. This seems reasonable from our side, but we wonder to what extent this can stand as a main recommendation in here, and whether we should touch in our guidelines on the other kinds of extreme cases, or it could be, regulations or countries where no information can be shared at all, and how would journals handle these cases, and having papers that stand there for years while we await the investigation, or places where the confidentiality is less and the full reports can be shared. So do you think we should include also these cases in our guidelines? And the final queries will be about can and should institutions review all of an author's publications if they are doing an investigation and there's somebody who actually committed serious misconduct, so that the other employers or past employers and publishers can be alerted to this. So we know that could be a lot of work for the institutions, but to what extent would it be within their remit? Should they only look at papers that were published, or the record that was published of research while the person was specifically hired at their institutions, or should they extend that a bit? It could obviously be important for them in their own investigations to determine the real finding or the extent of the misconduct, but also obviously it is a lot of work and we don't know to what extent institutions could commit to something like this. So with this, I will end here on these interesting questions. And as I said, we'd like to hear from you on these points, and we'll integrate these comments and these final points in our revised guidelines that should be published later this year after another round of discussion internally. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marie, and to the other three speakers. At this point, we would like to move on to the question and answer period. We do have quite a few questions, but are eager to entertain any others that come up. I'm going to read the questions that have been posted, and any of the speakers can pop in and give their thoughts about this. There's one here that was upvoted. You recommended earlier to make a distinction between data being potentially fabricated in a paper and an issue with a particular researcher whose action was unethical in the way they conducted their research. My question is, reciprocally, what should a journal do if they've been contacted by a university or institution who has identified a problem with one of their scientists? Should the journal automatically withdraw or retract any paper written by the scientist, or should each and every paper published by this researcher be assessed individually?
I can start, Nancy. I think it's very difficult to say that every single paper should be retracted, because I think it depends is the answer. But I would advocate that every paper needs to individually assessed, because researchers might, have a period where they didn't conduct, where there was no misconduct, and on the fifth paper there was. So for us, it's really only interested whether the data that have been published are valid, and we can't just blanketly say that anything that's a particular person who has committed some kind of misconduct at any point is guilty of everything. So that's what my answer would be, but it'd be interesting to hear what Susan thinks and Marie.
Yeah, I would say that when I worked at ORI and people came in to talk about a case, my answer was always, it depends. And that's the answer for this as well. It depends on the scope of the case, can always be broadened. And that's part of most institutional policies, that if you find more information, you could broaden the investigation to include additional allegations. I think it depends on what the case is like. If you have a junior person who made a mistake and there is one issue that needs to be corrected or retracted in one paper, there's probably not a whole lot of reason to go scanning the literature to see if that author has a lot of other problems in their papers. But if you have a case with 20 publications and 60 allegations, you might want to actually say, well, let's broaden the scope a little, at least look into the last 6 years of what this author has been doing, because there is a 6-year limit in the federal regulations. So we use 6 years as kind of like a guideline, and see, are there any problems in recent papers? Because an author has been accused doesn't mean that they're guilty. So I think that's really important to keep in mind. The data might not be correct. There could be a lot of reasons why that data is not correct, and you might not be able to assign blame. So I think you have to be really careful on when you just go out fishing for more, when there doesn't seem to be a good reason to do that.
Yeah, I would echo both comments so far. As publishers, we tend to look individually at all the papers to see if the findings are valid or not. Most publishers do find it hard to retract without a very clear reason for retractions. If we're talking about retracting content from people, it's slightly easier to reject. So obviously, as mentioned, depending on the case, there can be different types of misconduct. Some are more problematic than others in terms of published content. We might go more easily into rejecting a bunch of articles from the same author if they have a lot of submissions at the same time, if we are alerted to a particular misconduct. But retraction will need individual investigation of each of the articles.
I do want to add to that COPE does have guidance on the systematic problems with publications, which includes the issue of repeat offenders. And this gets into a real conundrum because of the problems of sharing. People who publish in one journal oftentimes have an array of journals that they publish with. And so the issue of communication between journal editors becomes particularly important when these are being investigated, as well as things like paper mills and those sorts of things. So I suspect this is going to become more and more of an issue, unfortunately, and will need to be a topic that is really addressed in our ongoing conversations. So the next upvoted question is, from a publication ethics editor's perspective, I think the recommendation to separate the accuracy and validity of research data from concerns regarding misconduct is important. as per COPE guidelines, articles can be retracted due to honest error or misconduct if the concerns are serious enough that the published results cannot be relied upon. For journals, it would be incredibly useful to receive institutional input that confirms concerns with accuracy and validity of the data in the article, regardless of culpability or intent. We rarely need to know about the latter in order to be able to make an editorial decision on the cases to correct the published record. Any comments?
Sorry, I do have one comment here. I think I'm glad that you agree that that is a good recommendation. I would say that what is critical in having this work properly is that the institution provides you with sufficient information about the data. So Sabina showed you an example of a notice to a journal that gave no information and left the journal hanging out there thinking, well, what's wrong with the data? I've tested it out recently where I tried to get a retraction of a paper, and I sent the editor-in-chief all of the information that the institution had about the data itself. The investigation was closed at this point, but I sent the forensic analysis that we did on the images, what the finding was, and I think that providing journals with the finding of an investigation and any data to support why they made that finding outside of the people who were involved is a way that you could do things, and had a much better relationship with that editor because he understood what the problem was. Although I must say the paper still hasn't been retracted. So I don't know why that is, but that's what I found out.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think, you know, this is all that we would need at a journal to make then this decision to retract the paper, because, and, you know, we should be able to also state that, of course, whatever the conclusions of your analysis and findings were in the retraction note. But we are not interested in who did this and why did they do this and, you know, who else was involved. We really just want to inform our readers at the earliest possible stage that some data are not reliable, cannot be trusted, are completely made up, or whatever it is. You know, I think that would be a huge difference to what is happening now, because as we've heard many times in all our presentations, that these investigations where you have to go through a due process on, you know, actually who is culpable and why, and, you know, look at all this GDPR and confidentiality and legal issues, take far, far too long. And this is where the only other route journals have then is to issue an expression of concern and wait. But we must inform our readers when we know that something is likely to be unreliable. You know, especially in clinical medicine, that would be terrible if we didn't at the earliest stage possible.
Yeah, and important not only for the reader, but also for future meta-analysis authors, because you don't want to be including potentially incorrect data or papers in a meta-analysis, because then it just gets perpetuated. So timeliness is very important. Can I clarify though, because I think Sabine, you had mentioned in your presentation that some institutions did not allow for the results of their investigation to be included in their in the journal's retraction statement.
Yeah, that came out on the survey that we did with UK institutions. But again, this would be very difficult, you know, because we do need to have a reason for retraction in the retraction note.
Yeah, so that seems like something that we really need to work on. Okay, let me go on to the next question. University response varies when dealing with authorship disputes versus research misconduct. Very few details are provided for authorship queries and share minimal findings. How can we request universities to share more information about how they came to certain decisions, because journals are often left dealing with the author who did not get credit? Any recommendations on how to persuade the universities to share more? This has been a fundamental theme in this whole conversation, so I think it's important to address this now.
Well, that's a difficult question because an authorship dispute doesn't have the same confidentiality requirements that a research misconduct process has. Okay, so institutions deal with research integrity issues outside of misconduct in very different ways, depending on the institution. My suggestion would be to contact the research integrity officer at an institution who can appropriately refer it to the right place and hopefully follow through with it to see if the issue is being managed properly. It takes a while. I'm working on one now that has taken months and months to get, you know, the proper information from everybody. But at least if you contact somebody who deals with these issues, it's not handled by the RIO's office, and we really don't want to see every authorship dispute, but we refer it out to the college. So if you go to the specific college that the person is working in and go to the dean and send it to the dean, they might take care of it, but they are busy. So things get lost and they might, you know, it's probably better to send it to a RIO's office if it's a serious issue that you can't work out with the authors themselves. And some institutions have authorship guidelines that you could look at. They're always published online somewhere. So you could look at their authorship guidelines and say, you know, the person who is, the people who are involved in the dispute, they should look at the guidelines and see if they could come to some decision, because all of this is about getting the kids in the sandbox to appropriately interact with each other. You know, it's really, if they were good, if they were people that were able to collaborate properly, that you would never be involved. They would just work out the issue themselves. So they need somebody to kind of mediate.
We do have COPE guidelines as well, obviously on guest and ghost authorships and different things like that. I was going to ask Susan, I guess then sometimes the RIOs would take care of these cases if they relate to misconduct. For example, if somebody is not added as an author and then there's a question of plagiarism, for example, if they published a thesis and then the paper is the information from their thesis, but they're not an author on the paper, right?
Yeah, again, a difficult question because different institutions have different policies. So at The Ohio State University, we follow the guidelines from the Office of Research Integrity that says plagiarism does not include disputes between former collaborators. Otherwise, you would have, everything would be a research misconduct case, and that just takes too much effort. So we exclude authorship disputes like that, like disputes between former collaborators, one person who took the data from another, and we deal with it as an authorship issue that has to be worked out in a different process. Some institutions include authorship in their research misconduct policy, and I don't know how they do it, because it means that every authorship issue you see, which there are a lot of them, you have to manage through the process, which is incredibly burdensome, as you see.
And one thing to note is that journals have authorship definitions or guidelines as well, which may be in conflict with the institutional definitions of authorship. So that adds another level of complexity. Okay, let me go on. There are quite a few questions. I do want to note that the slides will be posted on the COPE website if people are interested in seeing those slides. The next question, is there any way that organizations such as COPE can ask the major publishers to implement a standard approach around retractions so that self-reported article retractions are clearly visible? This may encourage authors to report honest errors more. Marie, do you want to take this from COPE?
I can, or you can also pitch in, obviously. You know, we are working on revised guideline for expressions of concern. I think that's one thing that also journals and publishers are a bit reluctant to use, and we think it should be used more. As we know, a lot of investigations take time, and we want to make sure that, you know, that if there are concerns about a particular article that expressions of concerns are used to warn readers and then either, corrected afterwards if the research findings turn out to be okay, or moved into retractions. There are various groups who are trying to work on these more standardized retractions to say, or to promote that retractions are not directly, doesn't mean, the label of having done something wrong or misconduct. This is actually also worked on by Retraction Watch, if I'm not mistaken. They have a list of retractions and they have different criteria for actual misconduct, for honest errors and different things. So this is coming more and more in the different organizations and in Crossref and in, Retraction Watch and in COPE, where you have different categories of retractions, some that are misconducts and some that are not. They're about validity of research and honest errors. So we're trying to promote that. But if anybody has ideas on how to promote that further and better, we're open to ideas as well.
Yeah, thanks, Marie. And that actually answers another person's questions. So I'm going to not take that one directly. This is slightly off topic, and I believe this is to directed to both institutions and to editors and publishers. Is there, can this group have recommendations on whether to develop guidelines specifically about looking at image integrity investigation, or should that be considered just part of guidelines for any investigation?
There are some papers that were published over the last few years about looking at images and putting them into different categories of seriousness, because sometimes the manipulation is beautification of an image, and sometimes the manipulation is a little bit more difficult to judge as, intentional falsification. And those articles, one was written by Elizabeth Fick and the other one was written by EMBO, some Bern Pulver at EMBO. Both of them are, I don't know, within the last 5 years probably. And that gives a little bit of guidance of how institutions can and journals can look at different images to make an assessment of whether this looks like potential misconduct or not.
Okay, great. I did want to add a comment from Rachel Safer, who is a member of COPE Council, and she notes that there is a NISO working group working on standardizing corrections, retractions, and expressions of concerns across publishers. So that is also being worked on. Okay, at what stage would journals find it beneficial to be informed about misconduct investigations, and why would it benefit them to know before the end of an investigation? Given the constraints of GDPR and confidentiality, journals would normally only be contacted once an investigation was concluded and allegations were upheld. In other words, when we needed to request a paper retraction or erratum.
Well, I think that goes back to the separation, doesn't it, of data validity versus the actual conclusion of a more complex and comprehensive investigation. So as a journal editor, I would say I would like to know as soon as possible when there is an indication that the data are not valid.
Yeah, it seems it would allow the journals to post an expression of concern since an investigation is ongoing.
Yes, also, as we mentioned, we would investigate from our side also all the individual articles if there are several from the same authors or research group. So if we're alerted early to this, we can start the investigations from our side on all the individual articles, or see if there are other publishers involved that would need to be informed as well.
And I'd like to make just one point. A research misconduct procedure would not negate whether something is false, fabricated, or plagiarized. The data itself stands, and whether the data is incorrect or not is independent of whether there's a research misconduct finding. So institutions will handle the process and find that the data is flawed, but can't figure out who was responsible. So there's no research misconduct finding, And we still contact the journal and say, this data is flawed and needs to be corrected or retracted. So the community really needs to start thinking about these things separately so that we could try to find ways to move forward.
Okay. A comment from a participant: separating retraction notices between honest error and misconduct can be very difficult when research institutions do not allow the public sharing of misconduct findings. Journals may know that there has been misconduct, but are not legally allowed to share this data publicly. Separating notices by honest versus misconduct without formally requiring that all institutional investigations are public, it will be impossible to flag many articles properly. So this is, adding another level of complexity to how we need to be thinking about this very important question going forward. So thank you for that comment. Journals often contact the corresponding author regarding any discrepancies in the research. However, when this is suspected misconduct, the central research teams are not always informed and are therefore unaware of the issue. This can lead to rogue academics going unchecked and also misleading for the institution, who are then not aware of what level of misconduct they are dealing with in an academic year. Does this panel have suggestions on how to remedy to this? And before you respond, I do want to note that there gradually COPE guidance is being updated to make sure that all of the authors, not just the corresponding author, are notified when there's a question raised, just as we notify all corresponding authors when a paper is submitted, to make sure they know it's been submitted and they're listed as an author. But any other comments about this?
Yeah, I was just saying that, we increasingly now would contact all authors on a paper when there are any questions raised. And I think that's also in the sort of more minor recommendations in the clue guidelines already. So I think it's important to do that so that everybody is aware. And in my experience, you then also get a much fuller response from the authorship group as a first reaction.
That's true. And that's also something we changed in the revised guidelines from COPE. And as I mentioned, one other change was recommended by the recent group that we surveyed about this, to make sure that we don't rely exclusively on authors to find contacts at institutions as well. So as Susan mentioned in her presentation, they can basically refer us to somebody who will have their back instead of the right person who can really do an investigation as well. So we're going that way also with the guidelines and COPE.
Great. Few institutions do not have the system of assessing the researchers done at their institution, which leads to fake research submissions. The director of research does not certify, and the whole issue depends on the reviewers and handling editors. How such ethical issues should be handled. It's sort of like, passing who's doing what here is the way I read that.
Well, I mean, in the context of research integrity, the responsibility is shared. So the people who work in the lab have to take their responsibility. The PI of the lab has to take their responsibility. The institutions do, the journals do, the funding agencies do. I mean, there's a lot of players that all have a responsibility in making sure that research is done in an ethical way and that there's no fraud. And I think that it is a shared system that we all just have to accept the role that each one of these layers has. It breaks down because people don't follow, they don't do what they need to do. So PIs don't, principal investigators in a laboratory don't always look at the raw data. They see a finished image, they say, okay, great. And then it gets published. So there's one breakdown. It goes through review processes. There are some cases of image manipulation that if you just look at the image, you could see that there's a problem, and it got through peer review. So peer reviewers have a responsibility. I mean, I think there's many levels that have to collaborate with each other. And the only way we're going to get this handled is that if we all start talking to each other about what our responsibilities are.
Anybody else have a comment from the panel? Okay, we have one more question, which is just perfect because we're about out of time here. And this question is, who should be the point of contact in institutions for addressing research misconduct or publications misconduct? Research often goes through ethics approval by ethics committees, but then authors at times do breach in the research and fake the publications. My question is, can't the ethics committee be the point of contact and scrutiny for research?
Well, I could only talk for the system in the US. I mean, there is a research integrity officer or somebody that has a similar name at every institution. It's usually in the Office of Research Compliance or the Office of Research Integrity. If you cannot find a person that's named as somebody who handles allegations of research misconduct, then I would go to the Vice President for Research, who is the person who leads the Office of Research. In other countries, the system is very different. What I usually do, or what I have done when I need to refer an allegation to another institution in a different country, is I look for who is labeled on the publication, who is the most senior person, although that's not always a great way to go because that could be the person involved. And I look at the institutional structure and I send it to the most senior person I could find. I don't give any information, but I say, I have an issue and I'd like to know who handles research misconduct. And sometimes I never get an answer. And sometimes I get a very good answer and I find the right person and things get handled. I think that globally things are changing. There's lots of different networks that are currently active. The Asia Pacific Rim Network, the African Network. There's a Latin American network of people who deal with research integrity because this is a global problem. And there are people that you could try to reach out to find the right person that you could contact. So it just takes some time sometimes.
Yeah, I completely agree. And, you know, it varies from country to country. I haven't come across many instances where the ethics committee would be taking that on. It's largely the Office of Research, Vice President of Research, or the leader of an institution. But it does take often some time to find who to contact. And, you know, this would be a great step forward if all the institutions were mandated to actually nominate or say very clearly on their website who the person is, whom journals or editors can contact.
At least it will be a requirement to become a co-council member for institutions. So at least moving forward, any institution who wants to join COPE will need that as part of their basic guidelines. That's good.
That's a great step forward and
Yeah.
a really good example.
Okay, I really want to thank the participants in this webinar for submitting such really interesting and well thought out questions, and the panelists for their robust discussion of them. What I'm taking away from this is this is very complicated. And I think we are going to have to need some time to work through, because clearly institutions, journals, and publishers have maybe different aligned. We're not totally in alignment with what the goal of all of this is. So that's got to get worked out. And then the details of how these relationships need to work the best are important to consider. So I want to close by thanking Dr. Kleinart, Dr. Garfinkel, and Dr. Soulier for their sharing their wisdom about these issues and raising such important questions. Thank you very much. And with that, we will close the webinar.